Listeners, the manipulated and the manipulators. Welcome to the OMM Research Podcast. The OMM Research Podcast is produced by DO-Touch.NET, a practice-based research network that focuses on osteopathic manipulative medicine research. DO-Touch.NET is based out of the A.T. Still Research Institute, which is located at A.T. Still University in Kirksville, Missouri. Please note that the views and opinions of the panelists in this podcast are personal to each panelist and do not reflect the views or opinions of A.T. Still University. My name is Corey Lubring, and I am the Practice-Based Research Coordinator for DO-Touch.NET and the host of the OMM Research Podcast. Before we get started, we also just want to remind our listeners that this podcast recording has video recorded with it, and it can be viewed on the DO-Touch.NET YouTube channel if you prefer to consume the episode in that medium. So as always, we want to start off by introducing and welcoming our panelists for this episode, and we're going to start off with Al.
Hey, my name is Dr. Alfred Amendolara. I'm a first-year resident at St. Luke's University Health Network in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and I'm in neurology right now.
And thank you for being with us today, Al. And then we would like to welcome Stephen.
Hey, my name's Steve Stacey. I'm the Director of Osteopathic Education for the Mayo La Crosse Family Medicine Residency Program in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and I am an Assistant Professor of Family Medicine at Mayo Clinic.
And thank you for being with us today, Stephen. And
You're welcome.
And you both have brought some interesting articles that we're going to be looking at today. And we're going to be starting out with an article that Al has brought us on osteopathic manipulative treatment and facial functional mapping. So I'm going to pass it over to Al.
Yeah. All right, so this paper is titled Autonomic Correlates of Osteopathic Manipulative Treatment on Facial Functional Mapping, an innovative approach based on thermal imaging. It's by Saratelli et al. It was published in Scientific Reports in, I believe, March of 2025. So this paper is a crossover randomized controlled trial conducted on healthy adults where they compared OMT to a sham therapy in 37 individuals, where they compared a baseline, a tactile treatment, and a post-treatment facial imaging. So they used thermal imaging cameras to attempt to measure autonomic parameters using something called seed correlation analysis. What their main findings are is that the sham group exhibited an elevated warming effect on the cheeks, nose, and chin, but the OMT group had in their words, conspicuous cooling trend in the nose, so a little bit of a difference. The comparative analysis of their thermal maps, and in addition to the seed correlation analysis that they did, in their words, represents a significant advancement in our understanding of the physiologic mechanisms underlying OMT's effect on the autonomic functions. So, yeah, I think that's a quick summary of it.
So before we hop into discussion about the article, bullet point for our listeners, the main high points you want to point out about this study.
Sure. So for me, a big positive about this study is that they are definitely attempting to dig into a little bit of the physiological mechanisms of OMT. That's not something we see a lot, and I think they have a good justification for doing that. I think their approach is interesting. I usually, or at least in my experience, have seen this seed correlation analysis mostly used when interpreting brain imaging, so looking at neural networks within the brain. And so I think it's interesting that they're using this approach on thermal imaging of the face. And other, in other ways, I think this was a generally thoughtfully designed study for the most part.
And then, of course, a
Did
couple
they?
quick bullet points for just caveats. Sorry to cut before we hop in, Dr. Stacey.
Yeah, so some caveats to this. I'm not convinced that they convinced me that there's a correlation between facial mapping, especially thermal facial mapping, and the autonomic effects that they're claiming to have. Their big conclusion is that this provides evidence of autonomic modulation from OMT techniques, but we don't get a good sense of what OMT techniques they're using. I don't think we get a good justification for why those OMT techniques might impact the autonomic nervous system. And then, truthfully, I don't see a good justification for why surface temperature necessarily directly correlates to autonomic nervous system activity as it relates to OMM's stimulation of those kind of neural pathways.
So, Al, tell me a little bit here about kind of the rationale behind this. You know, when I think of like thermal imaging and body and stuff, the first thing that pops into my mind was a scene from like Ghost Hunters, where they were working with a psychic, you know, and everything, and they were opposing their, you know, psychic medium onto a person to affect the body temperature and stuff. So it kind of feels just a little interesting to me that, you know, this thought that us doing, you know, hand manipulation on the people can actually affect, you know, the surface temperature that can be measured on a person. So give me a little more insight on that.
So their justification is that there's some evidence that suggests that OMT can influence the autonomic nervous system in general. It can potentially influence release of pro-inflammatory cytokines and a general kind of have an anti-inflammatory effect. Whether or not I'm convinced by this, I think is a bigger question than we have time for. But that at least is their justification. I will say
I'm
that other research I've seen has been generally directed towards heart rate variability. I've read a number of papers on that. I also think that maybe is a questionable metric to use for OMT
Sure.
and its autonomic effects. But
This was a image that caught my eye, you know, that was shared in the article for one of their figures, and I thought this was really interesting. So you were going to add something, Dr. Stacey. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think that there's this age-old question of, in a study, do you use protocolized OMM or do you use physician-directed OMM based off of the somatic dysfunction findings that the clinician finds? And in a mechanistic study like this, where you have certain techniques that are hypothesized to specifically modulate the autonomic nervous system, this seems honestly like an ideal time for protocolized OMM, because you're really trying to isolate a specific neurologic response to specific techniques, versus then when you use sort of physician directed OMM, you're introducing a lot of variables into a system that famously reacts strangely to different variables. So the autonomic nervous system is an incredibly complicated process with a lot of inputs and a lot of outputs. And if you're going to have a study where you're going to try to convince me that the intervention is having some type of meaningful effect on that process, you'd really better convince me that the control that you're doing, or the sham, is really inert. And I just haven't seen that the sham that they came up with is going to 100% isolate the effect only of the OMT, and not things like how much the provider is having them move around the table, get up, get down, how relaxed do they feel about having a gentle massage versus the actual effect of the tissue manipulation itself.
Yeah, and they can't compliment him during it either. They might blush, you know, type of thing. So
Exactly, right? What's the
no,
chit
I
chat
think
like?
that's actually a good point. It is hard to know exactly how much this thermal imaging correlates to autonomic activity. There's some research out there that maybe suggests that it does, But again, it's hard to say how convincing it is. And normally, I don't think that's a problem. I like the fact that they're using a relatively novel technique in an interesting way. But I do wonder if their conclusions are a little bit overstated because there are some open questions with both their methodology and their approach to study design.
Yeah, I do like that they are trying to advance our understanding of the physiological mechanisms underlying OMT's effects on autonomic functions. That is something that we definitely need to see more of in the osteopathic literature as we build up foundational mechanistic um, processes to determine what we ought to study and how. Um, and I think that there are ways that you could structure this study such that it provides more replicable and isolated data, stuff that you can hang your hat on a little bit more, versus this one was just a little bit noisy.
I agree.
So what would
Yeah.
you
Overall,
recommend? Oh, sorry, go ahead. Overall.
no, overall, I enjoy this type of study because I think it's rare in osteopathic medicine, at least for me in osteopathic research, to come across a study that I don't necessarily entirely agree with, but I enjoy reading the science behind it. And I think that someone sat down and designed this study and executed this study competently, with an eye towards advancing scientific knowledge, which I appreciate.
And
Yeah,
what
and I
would
and I
you?
don't want to overstate the problems with the study. Certainly
Mhm.
we need to see more research like this. As with anything, there are ways that it could be done better, and just mean this with constructive feedback in mind, I suppose.
And what improvements or next steps or progress on this would you recommend, Stephen?
So one thing would be to get a little bit more granular about which techniques you think would influence the autonomic nervous system and in what way, and then try just doing those techniques because you're looking at unconscious autonomic responses. So maybe you see if just sacral rocking has an unconscious autonomic response that could be measurable, and then you test a different technique and then a different technique, and you could look at a lot of different techniques and see which ones maybe have the biggest response. You could also do a better job at explaining the exact techniques that you are using and just really convincing the reader that you did absolutely everything in your power to make these two situations as 100% the same as you could. And it's just hard to see that that was done.
And Al, your
I will,
recommendations?
yeah. So this seems like the perfect study for a positive control. My biggest problem with their conclusions and the methodology here is I see this. I think their statistical analysis is reasonable. I think it's reasonably powered for a sort of basic science paper, despite the fact that they call this a clinical trial. Okay, I disagree that this is really a clinical trial, but I think they have a reasonable sample size for what they're doing. But I don't know what the positive, like what is our hypothesized positive outcome for this? And so without a positive control, we have kind of a negative control in the sham. But without a positive control, I have a hard time rationalizing what exactly is happening. To me, I look at their results and I say, okay, so one spot on their face was a slightly different temperature, but does that mean that we've influenced the autonomic system? I
Yeah.
can't answer that based on the data here,
Or is it how
essentially.
they were positioned on the table? And if we had found the opposite, like maybe the nose had been warmer instead of cooler, would we have also
Right.
concluded, yes, it modulates the autonomic nervous system? So,
Exactly,
yeah,
exactly. We have no
there's
yardstick by which to measure
right.
this by,
Yeah,
essentially.
we need probably some more definitive pre-hoc hypothesizing.
All right. Well, wonderful article. Thanks for the summary and breaking that down for us. And as before we move on to the next article, we do again want to just remind people that you can view this on the DO-Touch.NET. That's DO-TOUCH.NET YouTube channel with the video included with this episode. If you would like to listen to us there, and don't forget if you are enjoying this episode and are future and past episodes. Please feel free to like and subscribe to the podcast, so you can continue to follow along as we break down research as it comes out in the field of OMM. And Stephen has brought us another teaser here, brain teaser, that has to do with OMT working with the COVID mRNA vaccine response.
Yes. The title is COVID-19 mRNA Vaccine Immune Response to the Addition of Osteopathic Manipulation Treatment with Lymphatic Pumps, a randomized controlled trial by Eric Martinez et al., published in the journal Virus Research in September 2025. The research question they were trying to answer is, in patients being immunized for COVID-19, does addition of OMT at each vaccination result in increased anti-SARS-CoV-2 spike protein antibody titers compared with usual care? And the finding they report are the OMT group showed significantly increased anti-SARS-CoV-2 spike protein antibody titers at 3 weeks versus controls.
All right. So what are the main high points, bullet points that you want to highlight for this?
So I think as OMM studies go, again, this one is reasonably well done. Definitely some things that we can nitpick about how it could have been done better, and that's going to be true for nearly any study. So that's not unique to this trial, but I do commend the authors for being ambitious in the question that they asked. One one aspect about the question that they ask, they set up decently well some of the primary studies that were done to justify that this is the question that they decided to ask. Sometimes I think of, pardon the analogy, but I sometimes think of OMM as kind of like hot sauce, right? Where there are just some people out there that try to put it on everything, and other people are like, wait a minute, why is hot sauce going on this,
I
right?
put
And
hot
so there are
sauce on
some
everything.
things. Now, I'm a hot sauce on everything guy for sure. But even if you're not a hot sauce on everything guy, if you're going to be like, how much hot sauce is the right amount for tacos? Like people can get on board with like, okay, you're putting hot sauce on tacos. I get it. Then there are some studies where it's like, we're going to see how much hot sauce is right for ice cream, and you're like, like I mean, okay, I can see like the sweet and spicy, but you got to convince me that this is going to be the right thing to do, versus some other studies are like, let's test how much hot sauce is right for baby formula, and you're like, that just seems irresponsible. So this one's more of like, I would say, an ice cream, right? Where it's like, you got to sort of convince me that there's some reason why I should even expect that an external force applied to the body is going to modulate the immune response to an mRNA vaccine. And so they set up some prior research, and they said basically there's been a general osteopathic hypothesis, which, okay, nice and vague, but then they show that it's supported by preclinical animal studies and small human pilot trials. They don't really have any basic science rationale, which is a bit of a weakness, but I just don't know that any of that has even been done. So that's skipping some steps on the pathway of science. But they are, I would say, appropriately tepid about what they say the prior studies have done, where they're basically saying, um, these were small studies. We can't really conclude much by them. Therefore, we're doing a bigger, better study. It's like, okay, I'll buy that.
So before my mind starts going down which scientific pathway brings me the hot sauce and ice cream, what are the main
Mm-hmm.
caveats that you want to point out, for this study?
Yeah, so they had I guess let's first understand exactly what was going on here. So they had 104 adults, which exceeded their power calculation for how many people that they thought that they would need to randomize to find a difference. 91 completed the vaccination series, and each person was tested with COVID titers um, before and then serially throughout the study as they got the first Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine plus the second in the series, and then a booster later on. Some got the booster, some didn't. So they've got a nice subject flow diagram, so you can see like who made it, who didn't. They had, I think, some pretty appropriate exclusion criteria. People who were immune compromised, people who couldn't get OMM for some reason. Pregnant and breastfeeding, I don't know, had to be an exclusion, but a lot of IRBs get sort of jumpy about that, so I don't blame them for excluding that. So overall, I think that worked out pretty well. If you're going to fault, so there are a couple of things where I think it could have been a stronger, more compelling argument that the OMT was the thing making the difference. So their control is basically nothing. And it would have been nice to see some type of control that patients thought of as an active control, just to exclude the power of somebody knowing that they are in a trial where something is being done.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know why that should necessarily affect immune titers, but then again, I also don't know why exactly a lymphatic pump might affect immune titers either,
What
right?
is an immune titer? That's not a phrase that I've heard before.
It basically just looks at how much of the antibody is present in the blood.
Okay. I think that would just, I don't know why they could just say that. They had to use fancy word like titer, but
Yeah, well, see, that's why medical school is so expensive, is because you learn about 20 new $10 words every day, and you got to
Ah,
pay for all of them. Yeah,
I
I didn't go to
see.
medical school just to call it the belly button. Now I have to call it the umbilicus.
Oh, that's a fancy
I
word.
still call it the belly button sometimes.
So kind of break down the what were they doing that, like, when you said there was a blank control, just a flat control, were these people getting immunized at all, or were they just like, you
Yeah.
know
So the intervention was the OMT itself. Everybody was getting immunized. So it was
mhm,
really to see how did OMT modulate the response to immunization. And so everybody who was in the active treatment group got OMT at the index visit for the immunization plus another visit 24 hours later. And they did have a protocolized OMM where they spent exactly 5 minutes with exactly 1 minute per treatment on each of 5 regions that were meant to target um, the lymphatic system.
mhm. Al, what jumped out to you about this study?
Yeah, so I think there were a few things. I think they start out with good intentions, and it's generally well designed on the front end. But their solid sample size is very rapidly eroded. Right off the bat, they limit their primary analysis to COVID naive patients, which I think is reasonable given what they're looking for, but it's a bit of a bait and switch. We end up with less than half of our actual sort of stated power. I think our COVID naive individuals, you end up with an N of 51. The full cohort ended up with an N of 92. And it just, to me, it confuses the analysis a bit, and they seem to jump back and forth in between who they're comparing when, and really, I think the differences are a bit too sporadic for me to take these to heart. So, for instance, the IgG titers, changes from baseline are significantly different at 3 weeks when everybody is compared. The area under the curve for the anti-SARS-CoV-2 spike protein IgG titers are significantly different at the 13th week. And then the it just when they look at the naive group, it's different again at the third week, but less significantly different.
Yeah,
There's just a
which
bit of
is
variability in how they did their analysis, which I don't
and
love.
And there's, there are definitely a lot of variables that they are counting here and reporting which ones, express as significant versus insignificant. Um, so my main conclusion from this one, let's just say it doesn't change my practice, right? I'm not necessarily going to start doing OMT on all of my vaccinated patients based off of the results of this trial. But I think if I were somebody that was reviewing somebody's grant proposal to do a bigger, better study with more solid methodology and more patients, if they used this as the background and said, here's what we learned from this, and we want to like, I could see this as being very positive in terms of moving forward with the research direction. I'd really want to see these findings replicated by other researchers at other locations. Um, and and I don't think we're holding OMM to a higher standard than other types of treatments by insisting that
No.
that's what needs to be done before we broadly recommend practice change.
Hmm.
Um, so I think this is worth doing more studies on to find out, and then we look at the ones with the lowest risk of bias, pool those together, see what we come up with. There may be some there, or maybe we find out that this study was the fluke and it actually doesn't do anything. Again, um, I'm not really down on the promise of OMM to be helpful if this indication doesn't really pan out at the end of things, because I'm not usually putting hot sauce on ice cream anyway.
Mhm.
Right. Well, I think one of the weaknesses of their conclusion, this is interesting from a mechanistic standpoint, if this has some immune modulatory effects, but really their main findings are strongest in COVID naive individuals, um, which begs the question, what population would this actually be effective in? Because generally we're not getting IgG titers on every patient walking in the door interested in a COVID vaccine or really most other vaccines. Um, so I think there
Yeah,
is a question of if this is only effective in a fairly narrow population,
Yeah,
what
and
is
they did study the clinical outcomes as well. But
right?
honestly, in that I see the numbers as being too small to make
I agree.
clinical conclusions. Um, Again, hypothesis generating. Would love to see this done again by other researchers, see how well it replicates, if at all. And then, maybe we find out that this is a really cool thing that we ought to be doing. Or maybe we find out that this study this study was just sort of a fluke and it found too much of a difference. I don't know, but that's the cool thing about science is we can figure that out.
And so, Stephen, to kind of piggyback off what you said before, with like, if someone came to you with this was like their grant, final study type of thing, like, what do you see as like being the next steps, like something on that bigger scale that kind of redresses
Yeah.
this?
So I'd want to see this as a multi-center study. I would love to see a a more robust control. I would love to see whether patients knew they were in the control group or the treatment group. And then really looking at clinical outcomes would be the most defining thing here. So people don't walk around saying, "Hey, have you checked out my immune titers?" They care whether or not they get sick. And so immune titers are an example of a disease-oriented outcome, or a DO, versus how long I'm spending sick is an example of patient-oriented evidence that matters, or a poem. And so I'd like to see more poem-oriented endpoints. And they do have that a little bit here. It doesn't quite get to the level of really being clinically convincing, but to be
No.
fair, that's not necessarily what the authors were going for either. So I view this as a trial that I'm glad they did it. I'd like to see more, but if no more is done, I don't know that this necessarily needs to change clinical practice.
And Al?
So I'm going to dissent on that a little bit. I think that OMT needs more thought towards objective measures. There, I agree that the clinical outcomes are an important component, and I would like to see to more of that. But the results that they display here for their clinical outcomes are, in my opinion, useless. The N is simply too small, and I have no other data to compare it to. So it
Oh,
makes it
yeah.
really hard for me to interpret that. And I personally, it's refreshing to see a trial that is actually focusing on an objective outcome
Hmm.
measure. And I would like to see them stick with that, because really, before, in my opinion, before we get to the patient-oriented outcomes with OMT, we need to have a foundation in physiology and pathology and objective measures. And while IgG may not be all that clinically relevant for the patient, I think it does let us start from a foundation of saying we know this is doing something physiologically in the body. Um,
Yeah,
so
I don't
I
think
would
it
like to
needs to
see that.
be. I don't think it needs to be either or. It can for sure be a yes and. We can gather the
Yeah,
objective data and have more people involved in the trial such that subjective data rises above the level of, n equals 10 in two groups.
Hmm.
right.
Well, thank you both for joining us as our panelists this week with these articles. For those of you listening, please make sure that you follow us on your favorite podcast platform. If you want to hear more of us breaking down research, sitting in our chairs and talking like we know everything, which we don't, but nonetheless, just kind of breaking down what's happening in research right now and just, raising some questions and talking about what we'd like to see next. And if you want to get involved in the conversation with us, feel free to hop in the comments section of YouTube for this video, propose any comments or questions that you have there, and we'll be seeing about if we can address those, either offline or online in a future episode. If you want to catch more about what we're doing here in DO-Touch.NET, you can always go to our website, which is do-touch.net, which is do-touch.net, and find out more of what we're doing here within our practice-based research network. Al, Stephen, thank you all for being with us again this week, and we will see you all next time.
Ciao.
Yeah, adios.